Look at this photograph. Really look at it. It sits in the Library of Congress archive, preserved in acid-free boxes and climate-controlled vaults like thousands of other images from that era. Catalog number LC-NCLC 04409, May 25, 1909. The photograph shows workers streaming from the Amos Keag Manufacturing Company gates at noon in Manchester, New Hampshire. The image is black and white. The paper has yellowed slightly over more than a century. The composition is straightforward. The massive brick structure of the mill dominates the background, enormous, fortress-like, industrial might made manifest in masonry. In the foreground, a crowd of human figures moves away from the gates toward the afternoon sun. At first glance, it seems unremarkable. An industrial documentary, proof of American progress, a snapshot of labor and machinery, of production and prosperity. The kind of image a photographer might capture to document the scale of modern manufacturing for a company report or a newspaper article. But the children are what matter. They are not prominent in the composition. They are not staged or posed as subjects. But they are undeniably present, walking among the taller adult figures, their small frames barely reaching the waists of the workers surrounding them. Some carry lunch pails, metal containers for their midday meal. Some walk slowly, as if their bodies carried a weight beyond their years. Some rub their eyes with the heels of their hands, a gesture of exhaustion rendered in gesture. And here is what most people miss when they first encounter this photograph. It is noon. This is not the end of a full day of labor. These children have already worked 4 hours that morning. They are taking their lunch break. In less than 1 hour, they will return to their machines and work another 4 hours before being released at 6 in the evening. 10 hours total for children aged 8 to 15. The photographer understood what no one else seemed to notice. He understood that the real story wasn't in what the photograph depicted obviously, but in what it revealed to those who knew how to read its details. He understood that visibility and seeing are profoundly different things. A photograph can be displayed in plain sight, circulated among thousands of viewers, published in newspapers and pamphlets, and most people still will not truly see what it contains. He understood that the most powerful photographs are often those that hide their significance in plain view. His name was Louis Wicks Hine, and he was about to become one of the most important photographers in American history. To understand why children were working in the mills of Manchester in 1909, one must first understand how Manchester itself was born. The city did not exist before 1838. In 1810, Benjamin Pritchard founded the Amos Keag Cotton and Woolen Manufacturing Company. Initially, the enterprise was modest, a small textile operation powered by the Merrimack River. But in 1822, the company came under new management. Oliver Dean, Lyman Tiffany, and Willard Sales purchased it and began an ambitious expansion. They envisioned something unprecedented, not just a factory, but an entire industrial city, a planned community where the rhythms of life would be dictated by the machinery of textile production. In 1826, they purchased 15,000 acres of New Hampshire farmland. They bought every water right on the Merrimack River to prevent competition. They constructed massive mills, wooden structures reinforced with brick, designed with multiple stories to maximize the use of water power, flowing downward from level to level. The company incorporated officially on July 1, 1831, as Amos Keag Manufacturing Company, with a capitalization of $1 million, an enormous sum for that era. Offices were established in Boston, where the company's treasurer managed operations from a distance, with only an agent, manager, stationed in Manchester to oversee the actual factory floors and personnel. By 1838, Manchester officially became a city. The first workers arrived from New Hampshire farms, young women seeking to escape rural poverty. The company built boarding houses for them. They constructed stores. They provided housing. They owned the town completely. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, the complex expanded. Multiple mills rose along the Merrimack. Each building was constructed of warm red brick, manufactured by the company itself, at a facility upstream in Hooksett. Bell towers topped the structures, not for decoration, but for utility. The bells would ring to summon workers to their shifts, to announce breaks, to mark the temporal boundaries of the workday. In 1873, something happened that transformed Amos Keag into something far larger than a regional factory. The company became the exclusive supplier of denim to Levi Strauss, every pair of blue jeans that would eventually define American identity. The garment of miners and cowboys, of workers and rebels, was constructed from cloth woven in Manchester. Amos Keag wasn't just producing fabric, it was producing the material of American identity itself. By the time the Civil War ended in 1865, Amos Keag had established itself as one of the largest textile operations in America. But the war itself had dramatically changed the company's production. The Confederate States, which had supplied the raw cotton, were no longer available as suppliers. During the war, the company's foundry had manufactured over 27,000 muskets and 6,892 carbines. When the war ended and normal textile production resumed, the company found itself in a position of extraordinary opportunity. The Industrial Revolution was accelerating across America. Production demands were increasing exponentially. Workers were in short supply. By the 1850s, the textile industry in New England had discovered something troubling about labor supply. There was never enough of it. The first workers, the young women from New Hampshire farms, were initially sufficient, but as production expanded, the demand for labor exceeded supply. The company began actively recruiting. Advertisements were placed in Irish newspapers. Letters were sent to German communities. Word spread in Swedish port cities. Men and women arrived at Ellis Island with nothing but the clothes they wore, entered the United States, and headed to Manchester seeking work. The Irish came first, fleeing famine, then Germans escaping political upheaval, Swedes seeking to escape agricultural poverty, Greeks and Poles and French Canadians. By 1900, Manchester's population had grown to 45,000. Most of them worked for Amos Keag, but even this vast pool of immigrant labor wasn't enough. In the 1880s and 1890s, as production demands continued to accelerate, company managers faced a fundamental economic problem. They needed more workers, but immigration had limits. Employment had limits. Wages had to be kept low to maintain profitability in an increasingly competitive market. Then someone, historians cannot identify exactly who or when this realization first occurred, made a calculation. Children were cheaper than adults, much cheaper. An adult might earn $6 to $8 per week, a significant sum in 1890. A child might earn $2 to $3 for the same work. More than that, children were more compliant. They were less likely to organize for better working conditions or higher wages. They were easier to discipline. They were smaller, which made them ideal for certain tasks within the mills. If a part broke inside a textile loom, a delicate mechanical component requiring precise manipulation to repair, an adult couldn't reach into the space to fix it, but a child could. A child could climb into the mechanism, manipulate the damaged part, and restore function. Children's hands, still developing, could perform delicate work that adult hands couldn't manage. By 1900, children as young as 5 years old were working in American textile mills. By 1905, the practice was so normalized that no one thought anything unusual about it. By 1909, when Louis Hine arrived at Amos Keag with his camera, child labor had become simply another aspect of industrial production. No one was hiding it. No one thought they had to. The children worked openly. Visitors to the mills could see them. The company wasn't concealing anything. This was America. This was business. This was the price of progress. Louis Wicks Hine was born in 1874 in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, a small town in the northern part of the state. He grew up in modest circumstances. His father was a grocer, his mother, a homemaker. Nothing in his background suggested he would become a revolutionary or an activist. He was, by temperament and training, an educator. Hine attended Oshkosh Normal School and became a teacher. In his early 20s, he moved to New York City to teach at Fieldston School, a private preparatory institution. He was a conscientious teacher, interested in his students, committed to education, but not particularly distinguished or remarkable in his career. In 1903, at age 29, Hine became interested in photography. It began as a hobby. He purchased a camera and began experimenting with portraiture and landscapes. But gradually, his photographic practice transformed into something more purposeful. He began to see photography not as an art form or a personal hobby, but as a tool for documentation, as a method for recording reality. In 1904, Hine began photographing immigrants arriving at Ellis Island. For 5 years, from 1904 to 1909, he exposed over 200 photographic plates, families disembarking from ships, children gripping their parents' hands, their faces showing the complexity of arrival, hope mixed with terror, possibility mixed with uncertainty. Elderly relatives seeing America for the first time, their expressions rendered in silver salts and light. The work was powerful, but it was the work of a documentarian, not an activist. Hine was recording, preserving, creating a visual archive of American immigration. Then, in 1908, his life changed direction. The National Child Labor Committee, an organization founded in 1904 to oppose the exploitation of children, approached Hine with a proposal. They had been working for years trying to convince American society that child labor was a problem. They had published statistics. They had conducted interviews. They had written reports and pamphlets. Nothing had worked. The public remained indifferent. Legislators saw no political advantage in supporting reform. Manufacturers dismissed the reports as sentimental exaggeration. Politicians avoided the issue entirely. The National Child Labor Committee realized that they needed something more powerful than statistics or testimony. They needed visual proof. They needed photographs. They wanted Lewis Hine to travel across America and photograph children working in mills, canneries, farms, and factories. They wanted images that viewers couldn't dismiss or deny. They wanted photographs that would force Americans to see the reality of child labor. Hine accepted the assignment. For the next 10 years, from 1908 to 1918, he traveled to 32 states. He traveled hundreds of thousands of miles. He exposed himself to danger, to disease, to the constant threat of being identified and expelled from factory premises. He took 5,000 photographs. 5,000. But there was a fundamental problem. Mill managers understood what photographs could do. They didn't want cameras inside their facilities. They didn't want visual documentation of their operations. They actively prevented photographers from entering. So, Hine became a detective. His method was brilliant in its simplicity. He would arrive at a mill and introduce himself to the manager as an industrial photographer. "I'm documenting the machinery," he would say. "I want to photograph your equipment. Photographs of how large your machines are, perfect for publicity, perfect for demonstrating the scale and sophistication of your operation." Factory managers, particularly those in charge of major operations, were often willing to cooperate. They were proud of their machinery. They understood that impressive photographs of large equipment could serve as excellent advertising. Once inside, Hine would position his camera. He would ask supervisors to bring a child worker into the frame. "Just to show scale," he'd explain, "so viewers can see how large the machinery is in comparison to human scale." The supervisor would comply. A small boy or girl would be positioned next to a loom or spinning frame. And then, in Hine's own words, he would get the heck out before anyone realized what he'd actually photographed. In and out. Proof captured, documented. Before anyone could object or stop him, the photographer was gone. Hine developed other techniques as well. He would wear the uniform of a mill official. He would claim to be documenting working conditions for an insurance company investigating factory safety. He would interview children, asking their names, their ages, how long they had worked at the mill, what tasks they performed. He would write down their responses, creating a documentary record beneath the visual record of the photograph. Each photograph became more than just an image. It became evidence, testimony preserved in light. On May 25, 1909, Lewis Hine arrived at the Amos Keg Manufacturing Company in Manchester, New Hampshire. He had come to document one of the largest textile operations in the world. By this date, Amos Keg employed over 17,000 workers across 74 different textile departments. Mill number 11 alone, a single structure measuring 900 feet long and 103 feet wide, contained 4,000 looms running simultaneously. 4,000. The sound was apocalyptic. Workers had to shout to be heard by someone standing next to them. Lip reading became a basic survival skill. Every single day, Amos Keg produced 50 miles of cloth. 50 miles daily. Gingham, flannel, ticking, and the specialized denim that had made Levi Strauss wealthy. The productivity was staggering. The profits were extraordinary. Hine used his standard method. He positioned himself at the factory gates at noon, when workers and children emerged for their lunch break. He had his camera ready. The photograph he took that day shows the crowd of workers and children moving through the afternoon light. The massive brick mill structure rises behind them. The composition captures scale, movement, labor, and humanity simultaneously rendered in a single frame. What Hine understood, what he was deliberately capturing, was the normalization of the abnormal. This wasn't a photograph of exceptional abuse or unusual cruelty. This was a photograph of routine reality. This was what happened every single day. This was how American industry worked. The children walking in that crowd had already worked 4 hours that morning. They would work 4 more hours in the afternoon, 10 hours total, for wages that were fragments of adult compensation. Some of the children in the photograph can be identified, though their names were never publicly released by Hine. He kept detailed records, names, ages, occupations, number of months or years at the mill, but he understood the ethical obligation to protect the identities of the subjects, particularly the children. Of one small boy visible in the crowd, Hine would later write in his notes, said he has been there several months. Several months, 10 hours daily, breathing cotton dust, a substance that damages lungs, causes respiratory disease, creates permanent hearing damage. Several months at an age when children should have been in school, playing, developing minds and bodies unmolested by industrial labor. When Hine later showed this and other photographs to the National Child Labor Committee, they were shocked by the scope of what he'd documented. But more than that, they were energized. Finally, they had proof, visual evidence, images that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The photographs were published. They appeared in newspapers. They circulated through reform organizations and educational institutions. Magazine articles featured Hine's images. Pamphlets were printed and distributed, and people reacted. Some wept, some became outraged, some demanded change, calling for legislation to protect children from exploitation. But something else also happened. The photographs were filed away. They were archived. They were replaced by newer scandals, newer stories, the endless noise of a nation always moving forward, never looking back. The most powerful documentation of American child labor in that era, 5,000 photographs meticulously recorded, was largely forgotten. Most Americans who saw the photographs in 1909-1910 forgot them within years. Subsequent generations had no access to them. The plates were preserved in institutional archives, but their significance diminished over time. The photographs existed. The evidence was there. The children's faces were preserved in silver and light. But for over a century, most Americans didn't truly see them. Or if they encountered these images, they didn't understand what they were looking at. Understanding would require more than passive viewing. Understanding would require acknowledging that American prosperity was built on the extraction of labor from the most vulnerable members of society. That the cloth that clothed the nation had been woven by hands too young to hold a pen, eyes too strained to read a book. In the photograph from May 25, 1909, a small boy appears among the crowd of workers. He is not the central subject. He is barely distinguishable from the other figures. But he is there. Louis Hine recorded his name in his notes. He recorded the number of months the boy had worked at Amos Keag. He recorded that the child had been there several months. The boy's name was never released publicly. His fate after 1909 was never documented. Like thousands of other children who worked in American mills during that era, he enters historical record only as a detail in a photograph. A face. An unnamed child marking the passage of time through labor. What happened to him during those several months of 10-hour workdays? The camera tried to show. The photograph preserved a moment. Exhaustion visible in posture, resignation visible in expression. But the world wasn't prepared to truly see. The photograph has survived. It endures in the Library of Congress. It has been digitized and made available to researchers. Historians have examined it. Students have studied it in classrooms. But understanding what it shows, truly understanding, requires something more than viewing the image. It requires recognizing that the small boy walking away from the mill at noon was not an anomaly. He was not exceptional. He was routine. One of thousands, one of millions over the decades. It requires understanding that visibility is not the same as seeing, and it requires acknowledging that sometimes the most important photographs in history are those that have been hiding in plain sight for over a century. When you first look at Lewis Hine's photographs from Manchester in May 1909, you see what appears to be industrial documentation, factory workers, machines, the routine visual record of labor in an industrial mill. But if you understand how to read a photograph, if you know what details matter and what they reveal, the images transform into something far more disturbing. In one photograph from the Amos Keeg series, a small girl stands next to a textile loom. At first glance, she simply appears to be part of the factory environment. She wears a dress. She stands among the machinery. But look closer. The girl's dress is missing buttons. It has visible stains, cotton dust accumulated over time. The fabric is worn thin in places. These are not details of personal choice. These reveal what a child's life looks like when she works 10 hours daily in a cotton mill, 6 days a week. Look at her face. There is no smile, no expression of contentment. Her facial expression is blank, as if the machinery has emptied her of normal expression. Look at her hands. They are calloused, scarred. At an age when hands should be soft, her hands show evidence of repetitive trauma. The skin is discolored where her fingers have been caught and pinched countless times by mechanical parts. Look at her posture. She stands awkwardly, one leg slightly bent, her back curved in a way that suggests chronic pain. Her body seems to lean toward the machine, as if she has been physically shaped by the work. Hine understood this completely. He understood that the power of his photographs lay not in what they showed obviously, but in what they revealed to those who knew how to look. When Hine interviewed children to gather information for his captions, he did so carefully. He would approach a child with some pretext, asking about a particular machine, inquiring about their family, and while the child answered his questions, Hine would scribble notes with his hand hidden inside his pocket. Name, age, length of employment, type of work performed. The children didn't know they were being documented as part of a permanent historical record. Said she has been at the mill for 3 years, Hine would write for one girl. 3 years, starting work at age 7 or 8. By age 10 or 11, 3 years of labor constituted her entire industrial history. The physical damage caused by textile mill labor was not subtle. It was systematic. It was documented. And it was well understood by everyone involved in factory management. In an 1833 government investigation into factory conditions in Britain, medical observers recorded precise observations about what prolonged textile labor did to children's bodies. Factory labor is a species of work in some respects singularly unfitted for children. Cooped up in a heated atmosphere, debarred the necessary exercise, remaining in one position for a series of hours, one set of muscles alone called into activity. It cannot be wondered at that its effects are injurious to the physical growth of a child. The mechanism of injury was well documented. Prolonged standing in fixed positions caused spinal deformation. The weight of the upper body, combined with constant bending required to reach machines, caused the spine to curve laterally and forward. Over time, children would literally become shorter, their bodies compressed and deformed by repetitive labor. The legs curve, the report noted, and the whole body loses height in consequence of this general yielding and bending of its parts. By 1909, when Hine was photographing children at Amos Keeg, this wasn't speculation. It was established medical fact. Everyone involved in factory management understood that child labor caused permanent physical deformation, and they continued anyway. The economic calculus was simple. A child costs less to employ than an adult. Even if that child would be permanently deformed, even if that child's lifetime earning potential would be reduced, even if that child's health would be compromised for decades, the immediate profit calculation favored exploitation. In one of Hine's most heartbreaking Amos Keeg photographs, a young spinner, a girl identified in Hine's notes as having worked at the mill for 1 year, but appearing far older than her chronological age, stares directly at the camera. Her face shows what Hine described as a hectic flush caused by warm, close atmosphere. The warm, close atmosphere wasn't accidental. Textile machinery required humidity. If the thread dried out, it would break. So mills were kept deliberately hot and humid. The air was thick with cotton dust. Workers breathed this dust for 10 hours daily. The dust caused lung disease, skin infections, eye infections, bronchitis, and tuberculosis. Children working in such conditions would show symptoms within months: respiratory infections, skin problems, chronic cough. The hectic flush visible in photographs wasn't health. It was the visible sign of fever and infection. Hines photographs were published. They circulated widely. Newspapers printed them. Reform organizations displayed them in exhibitions. Pamphlets featuring Hines images were distributed across America. The National Child Labor Committee, which had commissioned Hines' work, used the photographs in their public campaigns. They organized exhibitions. They published compilations of Hines' photographs with detailed captions. "Spare the Children," one exhibition was titled. "The Destruction of Childhood," another. But something unexpected happened. Public reaction was powerful, but reform was slow. Some people wept at the photographs. Some became outraged. Some demanded legislative change. But others, particularly those with economic interests in maintaining child labor, resisted the implications of what the photographs showed. More importantly, visibility did not guarantee action. Millions of Americans saw Hines' photographs between 1910 and 1920, but seeing the photographs and accepting their implications were different things. Some viewers could look at an image of a 10-year-old girl working at a textile loom and accept intellectually that it was troubling while refusing to accept the moral implications. They could acknowledge the facts while rejecting what the facts demanded, change, or they could simply look away. Reform, when it came slowly. In 1916, the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act was passed by Congress. It prohibited the interstate shipment of goods manufactured by child labor. It was the first federal child labor law, but the act had limitations. It only applied to goods shipped across state lines. It only applied to children under 14. Industries fought the law aggressively. Some manufacturers simply changed their business practices to evade the law's requirements. In 1918, the Supreme Court ruled the Keating-Owen Act unconstitutional. The court determined that Congress had exceeded its authority by regulating manufacturing through interstate commerce restrictions. The law was gone. It took until 1938, 28 years after Hines' photographs, more than a decade after the Supreme Court had gutted the first federal child labor law, for the Fair Labor Standards Act to establish enforceable federal restrictions on child labor. Even then, the act had exceptions. Agricultural child labor was largely exempted. Certain industries were permitted continued use of child workers in limited capacities. Why such a long delay? Why, with photographic evidence as powerful as Hines' work, did it take nearly 3 decades for federal legislation? The answer lies in the intersection of economics, politics, and the human capacity for selective seeing. Manufacturers resisted reform because child labor was profitable. The textile industry, the agricultural sector, and other industries dependent on child labor fought legislative restrictions aggressively. They argued that child labor laws would damage the economy, raise production costs, and harm families that depended on children's wages for survival. They were, in some cases, correct about the family economics. Many working-class families in 1910, 1930 genuinely depended on income from their children's labor. Eliminating child labor without providing alternative support mechanisms would have caused genuine hardship. But the manufacturers used this legitimate concern, family poverty, as a rhetorical weapon against reform. They argued that it was better for children to work than for families to starve. The reform organizations countered that this was a false choice, that society could choose to support families without requiring children to sacrifice their health and futures. The debate continued for decades. Meanwhile, Hines' photographs existed. They were preserved. They were studied by historians and activists. But for most Americans, they faded into history. A new generation grew up without seeing them. The urgency of the message diminished. There is something crucial that must be understood about historical photographs. They preserve evidence, but they do not guarantee action. Hines understood this himself. In later writings, he reflected on the apparent failure of his photographs to create immediate reform. I wanted to show the things that had to be corrected. I wanted to show the evil of child labor when it seemed people least cared. The photographs did what Hines intended. They showed, they documented, they preserved testimony. But the world that looked at those photographs remained largely unchanged. In Manchester in 1909, children continued to work in the mills. In Georgia, mills documented by Hines in the 1910s, children continued. In coal mines, canneries, and agricultural fields, all documented by Hein with meticulous precision. Children continued to labor. Some reforms came. Gradually, state by state, legislation restricted child labor. Hours were reduced. Age minimums were raised. But the process took decades. Meanwhile, the children who appeared in Hein's photographs aged. They grew into adulthood. Some recovered from their industrial injuries. Many did not. Many carried the physical and psychological scars of their childhood labor for the rest of their lives. One girl photographed by Hein at a textile mill in 1909 would have been approximately 9 years old. If she continued to work in mills, by 1920 she would have been 20 years old. By then, her body would have borne the marks of 11 years of industrial labor. But we do not know her fate. We do not know if she survived. We do not know if the reforms that eventually came saved her from further deterioration, or if they came too late. We know only that she existed, that Hein photographed her, that she appears in the archive, preserved in light. The photograph shows her, but it cannot tell us what happened after. The photograph preserves the moment. It bears witness to the existence of exploitation, but it cannot undo what the machinery did to her body, her health, her future. This is the fundamental limitation of photography as a tool for reform. It can make visible what was invisible, but visibility alone does not guarantee justice. The photographs exist. They are powerful. They have survived for over a century. They have been studied and exhibited and taught to countless students. But the children in those photographs did not survive. In 1908, Louis Hein photographed a girl working in a textile mill in North Carolina. She was approximately 9 years old. Her name was not recorded in Hein's public notes, but her image was documented and preserved. In the photograph, she stands at a spinning frame. Her dress is worn. Her hair is partially covered with cotton dust. Her expression shows fatigue. But she is recognizable. She is distinct. She could potentially be identified across subsequent photographs if those photographs existed. Researchers and historians in the 21st century have attempted to do precisely this. Using archival records, census data, and careful comparison of photographic details, they have tried to reconstruct the lives of the children Hein photographed. In some cases, they have succeeded in identifying individuals and tracing their movements through Hein's archive across multiple years. What they discovered was devastating: the visible deterioration of children's bodies across the span of their industrial employment. The girl photographed in 1908 at age 9, if she remained employed in mills, if she could be photographed again 5 or 7 or 10 years later, would show measurable physical changes, not just aging, which all children experience, but degeneration caused by repetitive labor, malnutrition, and industrial toxicity. Her spine would curve more noticeably. Her posture would become permanently stooped. Her hands would show increased scarring. Her face would thin. Her expression would become flatter, more distant. In the early 20th century, such changes would be attributed to growing up or maturation. In the 21st century, historians recognize them as visible documentation of systemic physical abuse. In 1913, Louis Hein created something remarkable and disturbing: composite photographs. The technique was not invented by Hein. It had been developed in the 1880s by Sir Francis Galton, who used multiple photographic exposures to create an average portrait from many different faces. Galton used this technique to advance his theories about human ideal types. His work, though now discredited, represented an early attempt to use photography not just to document, but to create generalized representations of categories of people. Hein employed a similar technique, but with a radically different purpose. He would take multiple photographs of different children working in the same mill under similar conditions. Then he would rephotograph these images, layering them upon a single photographic plate, creating a composite image where the faces of many children merged into a single haunting figure. The result was extraordinary. The composite showed a child who was simultaneously many children. The image captured the commonality of experience. These were not isolated cases of unfortunate children, but rather a systematic pattern affecting thousands. In one composite, the overlaid faces create the image of a young cotton mill worker, approximately ages 9 to 14, compressed into a single visage. The faces of different children, different ages, different degrees of deterioration, merged together. The result is a child who seems to age within the frame, young features blended with older, more worn features, fresh faces layered with exhausted faces. When these composites were eventually analyzed by historians decades later, their power became evident. What Hine had created was a visual representation of what decades of child labor did to children. The multiple exposures, the overlapping faces, created a metaphorical image of deterioration itself. The composites were never published in Hine's lifetime. They were too unsettling, too powerful. But they survived in Hine's archive, preserved as testament to what he understood. That child labor didn't happen to individual children in isolation. It happened systematically to generations of children, creating a pattern of exploitation so vast that it could only be truly comprehended through abstraction and artistic representation. Contemporary historians have attempted something Hine could not have systematized in his own era, tracing identifiable individuals through multiple photographs across years. Using careful comparison of physical features, clothing details, and mill records when available, researchers have occasionally identified the same child appearing in Hine's photographs taken years apart. In one documented case, a boy photographed in a textile mill in 1908 at approximately age 8 can be identified in subsequent photographs taken in 1911 at approximately age 11. The changes are visible. In the 1908 photograph, the boy stands at a machine. He is small, thin, but his posture is relatively straight. His facial expression, while serious, shows some capacity for expression. In the 1911 photograph, the same boy is visibly changed. He is taller chronologically. 3 years have passed, but he does not appear healthier or more developed. Instead, he appears diminished. His spine curves noticeably. His shoulders are rounded forward, a permanent deformation caused by leaning over machinery for hours daily. His hands show visible scarring. His face has thinned beyond what normal growth would produce. The soft features of childhood have been replaced by sharp, angular features suggesting malnutrition. Most importantly, his eyes have changed. In 1908, there is something in his gaze suggesting a child. In 1911, his gaze is hollow, empty, as if something essential has been removed. 3 years of 10-hour workdays, 6 days a week, in a humid mill filled with cotton dust. 3 years of breathing air thick with fiber particles. 3 years of repetitive motion, standing in fixed positions, bending and reaching. 3 years of wages so small they provided little additional nutrition or health care. The visible transformation from 1908 to 1911 is not maturation, it is deterioration. It is a child being systematically destroyed by the conditions of industrial labor. Medical records from the era document the specific mechanisms. Prolonged standing caused spinal deformation, particularly in the lumbar and thoracic regions. This deformation was often permanent. Children who spent years in mills would carry the curved spine for the rest of their lives, even if they eventually stopped working. Cotton dust inhalation caused chronic respiratory disease. Within months of beginning mill work, children would develop persistent cough. Within years, many developed tuberculosis or severe bronchitis. The lung damage, once incurred, could not be reversed. Malnutrition resulted from wages insufficient to adequately feed a growing child. Most child laborers' wages went to the family for housing and basic necessities. Little was available for additional food or health care. The combination of spinal deformation, respiratory disease, and malnutrition created a visible deterioration that historians can document through photographic comparison. In the case of the boy photographed in 1908 and again in 1911, the changes are unmistakable. His body has been literally reshaped by the machinery and conditions of textile labor. But there is something else that emerges from careful analysis of Hine's archive: the children who appear only once. Hine photographed thousands of children. His collection includes photographs from hundreds of mills, mines, and factories across America from 1908 to 1918. Some children appear in multiple photographs. Others appear only once. Why would a child appear only once? Several possibilities exist. The child may have left the mill and gone elsewhere. The child may have stopped working. The child may have died. Hine may simply never have photographed that particular child again. But statistics from the era suggest a darker reality. Many child laborers did not survive long enough to accumulate years of factory work. Mortality rates for child laborers were significantly elevated compared to children who did not work. The combination of occupational hazards, disease exposure, malnutrition, and dangerous working conditions meant that a significant percentage of child laborers did not reach adulthood. In coal mines, the mortality rate was particularly high. Breaker boys, children aged 8–12 who separated rocks and impurities from coal, worked in conditions of extreme danger. They worked 10 to 14-hour days in unventilated spaces. They breathed dust and coal particles continuously. Falls from the breaker structures could result in crushing injuries. Cave-ins and explosions occurred regularly. In textile mills, the mortality was less dramatic but still significant. Tuberculosis was endemic. Respiratory disease was nearly universal among long-term workers. Industrial accidents, hair caught in machinery, limbs caught in moving parts, falls from elevated work areas, occurred regularly and often resulted in severe injury or death. When children appear only once in Heinz photographs, historians must consider the possibility that the child did not survive long enough to be photographed again. In one documented case, a girl photographed by Heinz at a mill in 1910 never appeared in subsequent searches through mill records or other archival sources. Her fate is unknown. She may have left the mill. She may have died. She may have been injured so severely that she could no longer work. The photograph preserves her image, but it cannot tell us what happened to her after 1910. In 1910, the U.S. Census recorded that more than 75,000 children between ages 10 and 16 worked in textile mills. The census noted that these numbers did not include children under age 10, many of whom worked in mills as well. If one extrapolates backwards and forwards, estimating the number of child laborers in mills during the peak years of 1900 and 1920, the number reaches into the hundreds of thousands. Perhaps over 500,000 children worked in American textile mills during this 20-year period. By 1938, when federal child labor legislation finally passed, this demographic had largely aged out of the workforce. Those who worked in mills in 1910 would have been adults by 1938. So, we have a generation of children, hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million, who experienced childhood labor in industrial conditions. We have a generation whose bodies were reshaped by machinery, whose lungs were damaged by dust, whose futures were compromised by early exploitation. Many of these individuals survived. They became adults. They had families. They lived into the middle and late 20th century, carrying with them the physical and psychological scars of their childhood labor. But some did not survive. Mortality rates among child laborers were higher than among children who did not work. The exact number of deaths attributable to child labor is unknowable. Deaths from tuberculosis or respiratory disease, from industrial accident, from malnutrition-related illness were not systematically tracked as child labor deaths. But the loss was real. Children died. Their photographs survive. Their names mostly do not. Part F. The Faces That Haunt. When historians today examine Heinz photographs, the original plates preserved in the Library of Congress, carefully digitized and made available for research, they are struck by something that viewers in 1910 might not have fully comprehended. These are not abstract representations of child labor. These are faces, real children, identifiable individuals. In one photograph, a girl stands at a loom. In another, a boy operates a spinning frame. In another, a child barely taller than the machinery stands next to an industrial apparatus designed for adult bodies. The faces show exhaustion. They show resignation. They show something that might be despair, though it is difficult to name such emotions in a photograph. The children in these photographs could not have known they were being documented for posterity. They could not have known that, over a century later, students and researchers would be examining their images, wondering about their lives, mourning their lost futures. But they are there, in the Library of Congress, in textbooks, in museum exhibitions, in the digital archives available to anyone with internet access. The photographs preserved them. They became testimony, proof of what happened, but the photographs could not save them. The boy photographed in 1908 and again in 1911, showing clear signs of physical deterioration. What happened to him? Did he continue working in mills until he was old enough to seek other employment? Did he develop tuberculosis in his 20s? Did he survive to adulthood and carry the curved spine and damaged lungs as permanent reminders of his childhood? We do not know. The girl photographed once in 1910, what was her fate? Did she leave the mill? Did she remain until the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 finally prohibited her labor? Did she die before 1938? We do not know. The faces remain. The photographs preserve them, but the rest of their lives remain unknowable. Louis Hine died in poverty. This fact, while dramatic, is perhaps not surprising given the arc of his life. He had abandoned a secure teaching position to become an investigative photographer. He had spent a decade traveling America documenting industrial conditions, accepting payment barely sufficient for survival. He had created 5,100 photographs, 5,100 images of exploitation, suffering, and systematic abuse, and had seen the world respond with insufficient outrage and minimal reform. By the 1930s, Hine was largely forgotten. The photographs he had created with such care, with such risk, had been archived and filed away. New scandals emerged. The nation's attention moved elsewhere. The children in those photographs aged. Some survived, some did not. But the world that had failed to save them moved on. Hine worked occasionally in the 1920s and 1930s, taking industrial photographs and teaching photography occasionally. But his main work, the monumental documentary of child labor, had been completed and abandoned by the society it was meant to reform. He died in 1940, recognized by a few historians and activists, but largely unknown to the general public he had tried to reach through his photographs. His reputation would grow only decades later. It was not until the 1970s and 1980s, decades after his death, that historians and photographers began to fully appreciate the significance of his work. Only then did his images receive the sustained attention they deserved. Only then did people begin to understand the scope and power of what he had attempted to accomplish through photography. But by then, the generation of children he had photographed was mostly gone. The children who worked in mills in 1910 would have been old or dead by the 1970s. The reforms that eventually came, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 and subsequent legislation, came too late to save them. The question becomes, what did child labor cost America? By 1910, approximately 1.75 million children under age 16 worked in America. Of these, more than 75,000 worked in textile mills. Another 200,000 worked in coal mines and canneries. Hundreds of thousands worked in agriculture, as domestic servants, in sweatshops, in street trades. A generation of children, 1.75 million of them, was being sacrificed to industrial production. If we calculate conservatively, assuming an average rate of permanent physical disability affecting 30–40% of child laborers, we are talking about 500,000 children whose health was permanently compromised by their work, 500,000 children whose bodies were deformed, whose lungs were damaged, whose futures were compromised. The mortality rate among child laborers was higher than among non-working children. Exact figures are impossible to calculate because deaths from tuberculosis, respiratory disease, industrial accident, and malnutrition were not systematically tracked as child labor deaths. But historical mortality data suggests that thousands of children died as a direct result of working in industrial conditions. Some estimates suggest that between 1900 and 1920, as many as 10,000 to 15,000 children died in industrial accidents alone. Thousands more died from occupational disease. This was the price that was paid for cloth, for steel, for coal, for food processing, for the industrial expansion that made America wealthy. The children who survived physical injury often bore lasting psychological effects. They had been removed from school. They had been denied the normal experiences of childhood. They had been forced into adult labor under adult conditions. The psychological impact of such trauma cannot be easily quantified. But historians and psychologists recognize that it was significant. Children who had been worked to exhaustion, who had seen friends and siblings injured or die, who had experienced the dehumanization of industrial labor, these children carried psychological wounds throughout their lives. The children who survived typically carried physical scars, curved spines, damaged lungs, scarred hands, missing fingers, lost to machinery, hearing damage from noise, vision problems from strain, chronic pain from injuries never properly treated. A generation of Americans entered adulthood not only psychologically traumatized, but physically compromised. Their capacity to work as adults was reduced. Their capacity to engage in normal physical activity was limited. Their life expectancy was shortened by occupational disease. State-level reform did occur. Between 1910 and 1920, many states passed legislation restricting child labor. Age minimums were raised, hours were reduced. By 1920, the number of child laborers had dropped to approximately half of what it had been in 1910, from 1.75 million to under 900,000. This is often cited as evidence of successful reform, and in some ways, it is. The fact that approximately 1 million children were removed from industrial labor is significant, and suggests that reform efforts at the state and federal level had some effect. But the framing of half as many obscures a crucial reality. There were still nearly 1 million children working in industrial conditions in 1920, and the reforms that had been achieved were fragile and constantly under attack by manufacturers seeking to reduce labor costs by returning to child labor. The Supreme Court's invalidation of the Keating-Owens Child Labor Act in 1918 demonstrated how precarious these reforms were. A single court decision could erase federal protections. It took until 1938, 28 years after Hine had completed his most intensive documentation, more than 20 years after the Supreme Court had invalidated the first federal child labor law, for lasting federal protection to be established through the Fair Labor Standards Act. And even then, the act included exemptions. Agricultural child labor was largely exempted, meaning that children could still work on farms. Certain industries received special considerations. The legislation was a compromise that reflected political power more than moral clarity. The true reform of American child labor did not come until the 1970s, as economic development made child labor economically unnecessary, and as international pressure, particularly regarding child labor in developing nations, shamed developed nations into enforcing laws on their own soil. What happened to the children in Hine's photographs? What became of the million who were removed from industrial labor between 1910 and 1920? What became of the millions who continued to work through the 1920s and 1930s? Some succeeded. They left industrial labor. They obtained education. They found better employment. They rebuilt lives damaged by their childhood exploitation. Some of these individuals became activists themselves, participating in the labor movement, advocating for workers' rights, attempting to ensure that future generations would not experience what they had endured. Others did not succeed. They remained in poverty. They worked in low-wage, physically demanding jobs throughout their adult lives. The physical damage incurred in childhood limited their employment options. Respiratory disease caught in mills or mines manifested as chronic illness in adulthood. Some died in their 30s or 40s from occupational diseases contracted in childhood. The economic gains their exploitation had generated, the fortunes made by mill owners and manufacturers, were not shared with them. The gap between what child labor generated economically and what it cost humanly is profound. Manufacturers generated enormous profits by paying children $2 to $3 per week. Over a decade, the exploitation of a single child might have generated thousands of dollars in profit for a manufacturer. That profit was privatized, enriching owners and shareholders. But the cost of that profit, the cost in permanent physical disability, in shortened lifespan, in psychological trauma, in lost educational opportunities, in constrained adult economic potential, was borne by the child and by society broadly. When a child's lungs were destroyed by mill work, the cost of treating occupational disease, the lost productivity, the shortened working life, these costs were borne by society through increased demand for charitable care, through reduced tax revenue from lower adult earnings, through the general social burden of having a population that was less healthy and less economically productive than it might have been. Economists calculate that the true cost of child labor, if you account for the permanent disability, the lost education, the shortened lifespans, the social costs of managing the health consequences, was far higher than the immediate benefit to manufacturers. But this calculation was not made in 1910. The external costs were ignored. The profits were captured by manufacturers and shareholders. The costs were diffused across society and across the lifetime of individuals who had been exploited. The photographs that Hine created were meant to force this calculation. They were meant to make visible the price that was being paid. They were meant to generate outrage that would translate into political action. They were meant to say, this is what we are doing, this is the cost, this is unacceptable, and they succeeded, partially. They contributed to reform, they influenced legislation, they stirred consciences. But the reforms were gradual, incomplete, and constantly under threat. The economic interests arrayed against reform were powerful. The argument that child labor was economically necessary was difficult to overcome, particularly during periods of economic depression, when families genuinely needed children's wages for survival. The photographs remind us of something crucial, that reform is not inevitable. That moral clarity about the wrongness of exploitation does not automatically translate into action. That visibility does not guarantee justice. That even the most powerful documentation of human suffering can be filed away, archived, forgotten, while the exploitation continues. The children in Hines' photographs appear before us across more than a century. They appear as they were at the moment the photograph was taken. The boy of 1908 remains 8 years old in his photograph, even though he continued to age and deteriorate for the next 60 or 70 years after the photograph was taken. The girl appears as she was at the moment of documentation, even though her life continued beyond that moment in ways the photograph cannot capture. This is the fundamental limitation of historical photography. It preserves a moment, but the moment itself does not represent the entire arc of a life. The photograph shows us what was, but it cannot tell us what happened afterward. It cannot tell us whether the girl in the mill in 1910 survived to adulthood. It cannot tell us whether the boy photographed in 1908 and again in 1911, showing clear signs of physical deterioration, eventually recovered from his occupational diseases or died prematurely. We do not know. What we know is that it happened, that children worked, that their bodies were damaged, that the nation that permitted this was enriched by it, that the moral cost was borne by those who could least afford to bear it, by children who had no choice, by families desperate for income, by the vulnerable and powerless. What we know is that it took a generation or more for the nation to decide that this was unacceptable. That reform came slowly, incompletely, with many setbacks and compromises. That even after federal legislation was passed, the exploitation continued in modified forms, in states with weak enforcement, in industries with political power to resist. What we know is that Louis Hine photographed it, that he captured evidence, that he tried to force the nation to see, and that his effort, while significant, was insufficient. The children continued to work, the exploitation continued, the photographs were filed away. Today, more than a century later, we view those photographs in museums and archives. We study them in classrooms, we use them to teach the history of American labor. We recognize them as masterpieces of documentary photography, as evidence of historical injustice. But the children in those photographs cannot benefit from our recognition. They are long dead. Or, if they survived to old age, they carried the scars of their childhood exploitation for the remainder of their lives. They never received compensation. They never received formal acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong. They lived in a nation that had enriched itself through their exploitation, and then, decades later, decided that such exploitation was wrong. By then, it was too late. The price we paid for cloth was calculated in mills by accountants who tracked profit and loss, production, and efficiency. The price they failed to calculate, the price that should have been calculated, was measured in the bodies and lives of children, in spines curved by standing at machines, in lungs damaged by fiber inhalation, in hands scarred by machinery, in futures constrained by interrupted education, in lives shortened by occupational disease, in the faces that appear in Hines' photographs, facing the camera with the resignation of children who understood at some level that they were not valued, that their labor was valuable, but they were not, that the nation would grow wealthy from their suffering, and that reform would come only after a generation had passed, only after millions had been exploited, only after enough moral outrage had accumulated to overcome the economic interests that opposed reform. Only after it was too late to save those who had already been damaged. The photographs preserve the evidence. They are testimony. They are accusation. They are record. But they are not salvation.